He wasn't like the other fighters. Evan Tanner was a champion, but he never wanted to be a star. He didn't care about fame, endorsements, or flashing cameras. What he wanted was clarity, a life without noise, a path without ego. So one day in 2008, he packed a bag, rode into the California desert alone, and vanished. When they found his body days later, the MMA world was stunned, but those who knew him weren't surprised. This was a man who had long wrestled with demons louder than any crowd, a man who saw fighting not as violence, but as a test of the soul. This is the story of a warrior philosopher who walked away from the cage in search of peace and paid the ultimate price for it. Before Evan Tanner ever stepped into a cage, he was already fighting for something deeper. Born in Amarillo, Texas in 1971, Tanner wasn't raised by coaches or martial artists. He was raised by silence. His childhood was turbulent, his parents divorced, and he spent much of his early life alone. He didn't grow up in a gym. He grew up reading philosophy and literature. It was in books, not boxing rings, that he found his earliest sense of power. But even then, he carried a restlessness that no page could tame. He stumbled into wrestling in high school, almost by accident. He'd never trained before, yet he became a state champion by sheer force of will. He didn't love the sport, but he loved the challenge. There was a raw truth to combat that appealed to something deep inside him. And when he discovered MMA years later, he recognized it not as violence, but as meditation. Fighting, he would later write in his journals, is how I quiet the noise in my head. What made Evan different wasn't just how he fought, but why. He had no formal training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or Muay Thai when he began his MMA career. He taught himself by watching VHS tapes and practicing alone. While other fighters joined camps, Tanner trained in solitude. He believed the fight was won not in the gym, but in the soul. That mindset, mysterious, almost monk-like, made him a fan favorite, even before he held a belt. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud, but he was undeniably real. By the late 1990s, Evan Tanner was gaining traction in small promotions, fighting with a style that blended wrestling, creativity, and sheer grit. He racked up wins in Pancrase and UFC, all while writing cryptic blog posts that read more like diary entries than fighter updates. "I am not trying to be a hero," he wrote. "I am just trying to figure things out." And that was the truth of it. While most fighters were chasing gold, Tanner was chasing answers. But the deeper he went into the sport, the louder the world became. The lights got brighter, the demands got heavier, and the demons he'd kept at bay since childhood started to whisper again. In 2005, Evan Tanner reached the pinnacle of his career. At UFC 51, he defeated David Terrell to win the UFC middleweight championship. For most fighters, that moment would be pure glory. For Tanner, it was bittersweet. You could see it in his eyes. This wasn't triumph. This was relief and a quiet confusion. He didn't smile with pride. He didn't jump on the cage. Instead, he walked away from the octagon like a man who'd just finished a long day's work. Because for Tanner, the belt was never the goal. He viewed titles as temporary. What mattered was the man he became in pursuit of them. Still, for a brief window, he was on top of the world. Magazine features, interviews, and UFC promo packages all painted him as the quiet champion. But behind the scenes, Tanner was already slipping. Fame, to him, felt like noise. He hated being seen as a product, hated the artificial smiles and scripted interviews. "It's not who I am," he wrote. "I'm not trying to be a personality. I'm just a man trying to find peace." He lost the belt later that year to Rich Franklin, and with that loss came a subtle unraveling. Not just in his fight record, but in his mental state. Tanner had always been walking a tightrope between self-discipline and self-destruction. With the belt gone and the spotlight fading, that balance began to shift. He grew distant. Fights became harder. His famous stoicism now masked deeper pain. Friends noticed that he drank more, slept less, and talked often about disappearing. He spoke of living off the grid, of riding into the desert, of building a cabin in the woods and leaving everything behind. And while most chalked it up to his eccentric nature, a few sensed something darker. By 2006, Tanner was losing more than fights. He was losing himself, and yet he kept searching for meaning, for solitude, for whatever it was that he could never quite put into words. He once said, "The greatest challenge is not in the ring, it's in the mirror." That quote would haunt everyone who read it after his final journey began. Fame never sat comfortably on Evan Tanner's shoulders. Even during his championship run, he avoided the limelight whenever possible. While most UFC fighters leaned into the fame, signing autographs, starring in promos, building brands, Tanner would often retreat. He hated being asked the same surface-level questions by reporters. He hated the shallow spotlight. What he wanted wasn't validation, but understanding. But that's not how the fight game works. You can't be invisible when you're holding a title. The more Tanner tried to shrink into himself, the more the world pried him open, and that tension between who he was and who the world wanted him to be started to break him. After losing his belt, Tanner began spiraling. He battled alcoholism quietly, and sometimes not so quietly. There were stints of sobriety, moments where he seemed to find balance, but the weight always came back. And the weight wasn't just alcohol, it was emotional. He'd lost friends, lost direction, and despite being a celebrated UFC veteran, he often felt completely alone. In blog posts, Tanner hinted at these struggles. He wrote about the nights he couldn't sleep, the days he wandered aimlessly. He wrote about depression, about how sometimes the victories felt meaningless. One haunting entry read, "I've spent the last few years trying to disappear. I didn't want to be found. I just wanted quiet." Tanner tried to restart his life many times. He worked odd jobs, lived in small apartments, even slept in his own gym. He took long motorcycle rides with no destination, bought a small boat to live on. He talked often about living minimally, about escaping the chaos of the modern world. But underneath that simplicity was something more fragile, a man desperately trying to heal. By 2008, Tanner's writings took on a new tone. He began preparing for what he called a soul-cleansing journey. He planned a solo trip into the California desert. His plan: live off the grid for a few days, face the elements, and reconnect with himself. He bought a used dirt bike, packed survival gear, and wrote optimistically about the adventure. But those close to him were uneasy. They knew Tanner was battling more than the sun, because when a man who talks about disappearing actually disappears, people start to wonder if he ever planned to come back. In early September 2008, Evan Tanner set off into the California desert with a sense of quiet purpose. He'd been talking about it for weeks, writing about how he wanted to live off the land, how he wanted to challenge himself spiritually and physically. But this wasn't just about adventure. This was something else, something deeper, something final. He chose the Palo Verde Mountains, a remote and unforgiving stretch of land near the California-Arizona border. Brutally hot, sparsely populated, and bone dry, it was the kind of place you don't just wander into. You prepare, you respect it, or you die. But Tanner believed he was ready. In his last blog post before leaving, he wrote, "The trip isn't a suicidal one. It's about peace, reflection, testing the limits of what I am." He packed light, too light, some would later say, canned food, some water, a solar-powered purifier, a tent, and a used dirt bike that was known to break down. But that didn't worry him. Tanner had always believed in his ability to push through anything. He wasn't afraid of the desert. He was afraid of what might happen if he didn't go. What he didn't expect, or maybe didn't care about, was just how hot the desert was becoming. Temperatures soared past 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The landscape, beautiful and vast, became a scorching, deadly trap. Somewhere during that trip, the dirt bike broke down. Communication stopped. His phone had no signal, and the nearest human being was miles away. Still, no one panicked at first. Tanner had disappeared before. He was a loner, a wanderer. He always came back. But this time, he didn't. Days passed. No calls, no messages. The blog went silent. Friends grew anxious, then alarmed. A missing person report was filed. A search party was organized, but by the time they reached his campsite, it was already too late. They found the tent pitched neatly under a makeshift tarp. They found supplies half-used and evidence he'd tried to find water. But the body of Evan Tanner was discovered a short distance away, collapsed in the sand, alone, dehydrated, exhausted. The official cause? Heat exposure. But anyone who knew him understood it was more than that. The desert didn't kill him. The years did. Because when Evan Tanner walked into that desert, he wasn't just searching for peace. He was searching for silence. And he found it. It was September 5th when the world last heard from Evan Tanner. He sent a message message from his satellite device, simple, vague, and optimistic. But by the 6th, nothing. The sun rose. The sun set. Still nothing. UFC fans were used to Tanner's silence. His disappearances were part of his mystique. But this time, the silence grew too loud to ignore. On September 8th, concern turned into action. Friends, fellow fighters, and fans reached out to local authorities. A search party was quickly assembled. Helicopters, ATVs, rescue teams, but the desert doesn't give up its secrets easily. The terrain was punishing. Scorching winds, cracked sand, and miles upon miles of emptiness. Searchers combed the area around Clap Spring, a small oasis Tanner had mentioned. What they found wasn't what anyone hoped. On September 10th, Evan Tanner's body was discovered in the desert scrub, just over a mile from his campsite. He had tried to walk to a nearby spring but collapsed before making it. He was just 37 years old. When the news broke, the MMA world stood still. Social media lit up with shock, grief, and disbelief. Dana White issued a statement calling him one of the most thoughtful and unique fighters the UFC has ever known. Fighters like Forrest Griffin and Rich Franklin expressed heartbreak. Evan was a warrior and a poet. One tweet read, "He fought with his fists, but also with his heart." The finality of it hit hard. This wasn't a death in the cage. This wasn't an overdose or a violent end. It was something almost mythic. A man walking into the wilderness and never returning. There was something ancient about it, something poetic, and that made it hurt more. The autopsy was clear: heat exposure, dehydration. But the story behind the science was far more complex. Evan Tanner didn't die because he was reckless. He died because he was searching for meaning, for stillness, for something only he could understand. And in a way, maybe he did understand. Maybe he knew he wouldn't come back. Because in his final blog entry before the trip, he wrote, "I've always believed that one should go where they're afraid to go." He wasn't running away. He was heading toward something, even if no one else could see it. The ripple effect of Evan Tanner's death was immediate and raw. UFC fighters, young and old, shared stories of him. Not about his victories, but about his humanity. He wasn't the kind of guy who partied after fights or sought out attention at press conferences. He was the guy who sat alone in a corner, notebook in hand, lost in thought. And that version of Evan, the one most fans never got to see, was the one that broke people's hearts the most. Randy Couture said in an interview, "He was a beautiful soul, man. He was always trying to figure out life. He just never stopped asking questions." Rich Franklin, who beat him in the octagon, called him a warrior in the truest sense. Fighters who had barely known him still wept publicly, because even from afar, you could feel the weight he carried. Dana White arranged for a video tribute at the next UFC event. It wasn't flashy, just a simple montage of Evan's fights, his words, and a single line at the end. He was different, and that's what made him great. But beneath the public mourning, there were deeper conversations starting to happen about mental health, about isolation, about how the fight world often forgets the fighters once the spotlight fades. Tanner's death didn't just hurt, it exposed something. The reality that even champions can feel invisible. A few fighters started speaking more openly about their mental health. Others started training differently, talking differently, checking in on each other more. For a brief moment, Evan's death pulled back the curtain on the violence beneath the violence. Not just in the cage, but in the soul. And as the days turned into weeks, fans continued to visit his old blog, reading his posts like scripture. They left comments years after his death, messages of gratitude, heartbreak, and hope. Because Evan Tanner didn't just leave behind a fight record, he left behind a map, a flawed, messy, beautiful map of what it means to be human. And in doing so, he became something more than a fighter. He became a mirror. Evan Tanner left behind no mansion, no brand, no million-dollar gym. He didn't cash in on his name, didn't attach himself to a franchise, didn't write a book, didn't sign an exclusive deal with a podcast. His legacy was intangible, written in the margins of forums, remembered in the quiet spaces between fights. Unlike many MMA pioneers, he didn't chase marketability, he chased truth. And truth, as it turns out, doesn't sell easily in combat sports. He was the UFC middleweight champion, a title most fighters would build a career on. But Tanner barely mentioned it. To him, it was just a moment, a milestone in a journey, not the journey itself. He once wrote, "I didn't come to this sport for fame or money. I came because I had questions." That was Evan, a man who treated fists as philosophy. Fans remember him for the strange contradictions. A cage fighter who quoted Buddhist monks, a brawler who meditated, a man covered in bruises who would sit and write about love, nature, and loneliness. He started a project called Team Tanner, a grassroots idea meant to inspire young people to explore, to think for themselves, to embrace discomfort. It never took off commercially, but to those who followed it, it felt like a movement. After his death, his old blog posts were archived and circulated. Lines he wrote years before started to resonate in a way they hadn't while he was alive. "We must take adventures in order to know where we truly belong." He had written that in 2007, a year before he walked into the desert. Fans began to connect the dots, reading his entire career as a slow build-up to a single symbolic act, vanishing into nature. This wasn't mythology, it was pain. Tanner's legacy wasn't curated, it was raw. Fighters like Mark Coleman, Jens Pulver, and even Conor McGregor have referenced him in passing, always with a tone of reverence. Not because he was the most dominant, but because he was the most real. In the years since his death, efforts have been made to honor him. A scholarship fund, a gym named after him, commemorative shirts worn by fighters on weigh-in day, but the tributes always feel quiet, almost unfinished. And maybe that's appropriate, because Tanner himself was unfinished. He was a work in progress, always searching, always shifting, and that's what haunts people the most. He wasn't supposed to be a ghost. While the UFC stored his record in their vaults, the internet kept something more valuable: his words. Evan Tanner's blog became, in hindsight, a roadmap into his soul. He wasn't writing to build a fan base. He wasn't writing to promote fights. He was writing because he had to, because it was the only way he could make sense of the noise in his head. The entries were sparse, poetic, sometimes rambling. He talked about coffee, about wind, about long drives with no destination. But if you read closely, the patterns were there, confessions disguised as philosophy. "I don't know what I'm looking for," he once wrote, "but I'll know it when I find it." That single line captured who he was. A man always moving forward, even when he didn't know the destination. In one blog, he described staring at the stars alone in the desert. "The silence out here is like a language. I think I understand it more than people." There was beauty in his solitude, but also a warning. A man who talks to silence is a man who's been hurt by sound. And while many saw him as eccentric, those closest to him understood that these writings weren't poetry, they were survival. His journal became posthumous scripture in MMA circles. Fighters began sharing screenshots, quoting his lines before their own fights, wearing Tanner's words on their sleeves like armor, not because it made them better fighters, but because it reminded them why they were fighting. And in a sport where so much is about domination, about ego, about being the loudest voice in the room, Tanner's voice came as a whisper that somehow echoed louder than all the shouting. The UFC never fully embraced that part of him. Maybe they couldn't. He didn't fit the poster boy mold. He didn't market well. He didn't brag. He didn't insult opponents. He didn't sell fights. He lived them. But his fans did the work the company never could. They kept his journal alive. They passed it on. They made sure the whisper never faded. Because, in the end, the journal didn't just chronicle Evan Tanner's life, it outlived it. Years have passed. The sport has changed. New champions rise, promotions evolve, and highlight reels flood the internet every week. But somewhere in the silence, Evan Tanner remains. Not in headlines, not in commercials, but in the memory of something different. Something the sport doesn't see anymore. A fighter who never fought for applause. At MMA gyms around the country, some coaches still mention his name during orientation, not as a technique specialist, but as a warning. "There's more to this life than titles," they'll say. "Look up Evan Tanner when you get home," and some of those kids do. They find the blog, the story, the death, and they realize this was no cautionary tale. This was a map of how to live with questions and fight through silence. In documentaries and fan-made tributes, you can still hear his voice, calm, thoughtful, a little unsure, but always present. He didn't talk like a fighter, he talked like a man writing his own eulogy in real time. "It's not the destination," he said in a rare interview, "it's how you walk the road." It was never about victory for him, it was about the walk. And that's what stays with people. Not his knockouts, not his belt, not even the tragedy of his death, but the walk. The slow, steady march into the unknown, the willingness to be alone, the refusal to be anything other than himself. Evan Tanner may have died in the desert, but the silence he embraced that day still hums beneath the noise of the sport he once gave his life to. And if you listen close enough, in the quiet moments between fights, when the crowd is waiting, the cage is empty, and the lights flicker down, you can still feel him, not as a ghost, but as a presence, still walking.